What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hartness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredient that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Lisette van der Sandt, and we talk about resilience and positivity in times of a global pandemic and in times of change. Yes. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, why don't you visit workshops.work and download my free one-page summary. And now, lean back and enjoy the show. Hello, Lisette. Welcome to the show.
Miriam, thank you for the invitation.
I'm so happy to have you here today to talk about positivity, about resilience in times of a global pandemic that doesn't seem to end soon.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to be talking to you and explore this topic together.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear what we can actually do and what managers can do to keep their teams up and positive and to build our own resilience. And before we get there, I always love to start the interview with the question, when did you start calling yourself a facilitator?
Oh, I think that was actually after I started my business, but not in the beginning. Because actually, I was not a real fan of workshops when I started my own business as a change manager. When I started my business, the experience I had with workshops from a corporate world were usually very poorly executed workshops. So I was like, I don't want to do workshops with my firm because basically you don't get the follow-up and you don't get the consistency to see real results. But over the years, I've discovered that workshops are actually a perfect instrument and way to use in a change trajectory, in a change journey as it is. So I think from that moment on, I got to calling myself a change facilitator and a workshop facilitator as well.
Oh, beautiful. And I'm curious to just dig a little bit into this experience of bad workshops, because I had the same and I felt a lot of resistance when I started calling myself a facilitator. Oh, workshop, are people still doing that?
Yeah, exactly.
So what do you think distinguishes a good workshop from a bad workshop?
I think if you've got a good workshop, it's really designed for a specific purpose and it's really carefully drawn up. I think it's important to really engage people. If there's some kind of learning going on into the direction of it being a training, then it's really lovely when it's experiential. And I always try to have like the interactivity ratio for every workshop I do, whether that's a training or even a normal workshop. But I think the interactivity level needs to be at least 50%. So even when I give a training and people need to get lots of tools, I want it to be at least 50% interactive, that the people are working and I'm not talking. I might be answering questions, but I'm not doing anything actively because they're working, they're exploring, they're doing exercises, they're in group discussions. So I think the experiential and interactive element is really important. And then that the workshop has to be connected to whatever you're trying to do. So I like this with trainings and with workshops, that it's not just a standalone thing, but as part of a bigger journey. And I think that's where that's one of the upsides of Corona, actually, and working virtually, because it's so much easier now to say, okay, no, we're not going to do 2 days of training or 2 days of workshops, but we're spreading it out over a larger period of time and do half a day, for example, every time.
Yeah, I totally agree that it gives us the flexibility now to split it into shorter chunks. And then and then the group really stays engaged.
Yeah, and it works for international groups as well, because before, international groups, I'm doing a leadership program with a group, and before, all these people had to travel from different countries to one central location. I, as a facilitator, had to go there, and then obviously it's not really possible to say, let's fly them in and get them in and out all the time. That's much more easy right now. And I like the idea of them having these kind of micro interventions, where you've got like short experiments or short things that you can give them. You try it out for example, a week or 2 weeks, and then you get back to, hey, what have you learned? And then talk about it, give them the discussion possibilities or possibilities to ask any questions on what they've experienced. So you can then really have a very steep learning curve in that case.
And make it a journey, as you mentioned before.
Yeah.
And I would like to jump on that to immediately dive into the topic, because what I realized, especially was now during the Corona period, working with international groups, I realized that they're in very different mindsets depending on where they're located. So, for instance, Melbourne was in a very severe lockdown for a very long time, or the US are much more affected than Europeans. And I could sense this in the spirit and in the dynamic of the group. So what are you doing to be mindful about this difference in feelings and positivity and mindset in spirit across the group, and how can you lift it without neglecting the troubles and the emotions that the people are going through?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to really give some space for the different experience that people are having and to talk about what they're experiencing, because that's obviously very helpful if people are working together in different groups. And the example you mentioned of Melbourne and the US compared to, for example, other countries, so it's good to just have people to share what they're going through. You can do this in smaller groups. And I think at the same time, it seems like most people are affected. It's not that half of the globe is not affected and the other half is severely affected. All people seem to be somewhat affected or severely affected. And then you can, for example, give them tools or ideas to just up their positivity. For example, one of the exercises I often do is just ask them, what are you grateful for? In the morning, if you wake up and look back 24 hours, what are you grateful for? And I'm not talking about the grand scheme and major life decisions, but like the small things, like, for example, I had on my list, like having a cup of coffee outside in the sunshine, or going for an afternoon walk, or reaching out to someone and having a nice sort of peer coaching conversation. They can be really small things. And those are kind of tools that you can give to everybody, and everybody can apply it to their situation. It doesn't matter whether you're gravely affected or just slightly affected, it still works and ups your positivity.
Agree. And I think it also binds the group together, because it's, as you said, something that we all go through together. Nobody's not affected, and everyone has a Corona story to tell, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
Either being affected by the virus itself, or even the journey that we went through by being in a lockdown and having to adjust.
Yeah, it seems like everybody is human. And I think another important thing to remember is it's not about the greatest suffering in this case. Like I have, for example, a relative of mine who is severely affected, who was in the intensive care unit of a hospital over 3 weeks and went into, it was very heavy. He almost passed away a couple of times, and luckily for us as family, he pulled through. And he went through an intense period of recovery and going to a specialized center to help him to learn how to swallow again, how to walk again, because those were things he couldn't do anymore. And I think in those situations, it's important to remember it's not about the greatest suffering, because obviously if I compare what everybody went to, and most people I know, but obviously his suffering is greatest. But the fact that he had the greatest struggle, that doesn't mean that someone else, I was speaking to parents as well who didn't have any childcare facilities, that didn't have any grannies or granddads or other people that they could ask for to look after their children, and they were really struggling, not having any sleep. You'd see them really exhausted, and they're also suffering. And just because someone is perhaps suffering more doesn't mean that you shouldn't be kind to people that might have a little bit less of suffering, and being open to listening to what people are going through and be understanding and lending an ear for them, and just being there and being compassionate with yourself, but also with other people. I think that's important.
Yeah, not neglecting. I like that. Not neglecting the suffering of someone just because it isn't as life-threatening, but it is still a burden, and everyone has their own relative perception.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you have the impression that during this period now, the check-ins, just asking how people are doing and what they're grateful for, needs more time in a session in general?
I think so too, particularly right now as we're recording this conversation. Some countries are going back into the second lockdown, are still in the first lockdown, but we're definitely after summer right now. So meteorologically speaking, we're going through the darker months, which is not that great for corona. And I think that you see that it's getting more difficult. If you just look at people, whether you're just on a Zoom call and looking at their screens, I see that people are definitely looking more exhausted. You can see that some people are a bit worn down. So in those cases, it's really important to talk about it. Because if you don't talk about it or you don't acknowledge it, it's still going to be there. It seems like sometimes managers, because they don't really know what to do and they're not trained psychologists, or they say, I don't know what to do, and it's so difficult. Just by not addressing it, that doesn't mean that's not there, because it is there. And I think if you talk about it, it makes it easier for other people. They might feel that it's a shared experience, and shared experiences always offers some relief to the situation. And you might be able to help other people or suggest something, have a nice initiative as a manager. Just by knowing what is going on, you're able to then use that input to move forward.
Yeah, just to provide the space. So I can imagine that managers, especially those who are not experienced in actually holding the space and having these kind of conversations, maybe even the teams not having the level of trust. How can actually maybe unexperienced manager create or invite the group then to share and maybe build resilience as a team together in this time?
I think what happens often is that because we're in times of great uncertainty, and I think what happens often is that some inexperienced leaders or managers or team leaders, that they actually think, I'm the leader, so I should take the uncertainty away. So they're coming up, but this is going well and that's going well, and they're trying to sort of take the uncertainty away. Whereas research also shows that sometimes you need to embrace the uncertainty and say, guys, this is a really uncertain time. And opening up yourself and sharing something that happened to you, or how your family is coping, for example, I think that's a really powerful thing for you to open up first. Because if you set the example and open up, or for example, if you're in a very stressful situation and you've got much more work on your plate than normally, if you don't say, well, I was very busy at work and I worked extra hours, but I spent some time at 6 to have some dinner with my family and I didn't pick up on the phone when it rang, I didn't go into that session that someone randomly invited me to. I think those kind of examples can be really good, because people see, he's living or she's living the talk, she's actually doing that. And it gives other people permission to set some boundaries, for example, between work and personal life, or it gives other people permission to actually share that it is really difficult living with 3 children, having 3 children at home and still having to work and homeschooling your children, for example.
Yeah, and showing the human side that connects us. Yeah. And you mentioned before, or we talked about it, that the suffering is relative. And actually the positivity or resilience is also relative, right? Everyone finds different means of coping with it and staying positive. And I can imagine that if someone is constantly working on their mindset and trying to remain positive and seeing this bright side of the situation, this can also positively, but maybe also negatively impact the group dynamics when they're too far apart. Are there tricks to bring this together or deal with it, to acknowledge positivity, nurture it, but without forcing it maybe?
Yeah, I love that you're talking about the two worlds. I had a conversation with a manager about, a manager that said, I seem to be living in a completely different world or completely different universe than other people. And I think what's important is that positivity has to be sincere. So it has to be genuine and heartfelt. That's the thing with research has shown, for example, that people that have more positivity and whose positivity ratio is higher, that they're also more resilient, because positivity is one of the most active critical ingredients when you're highly resilient, when you have a highly resilient personality. But for that to work, it needs to be heartfelt positivity. So you can say, like, I want the situation to be better, and you're sort of trying to convince yourself logically that this is positive, but you don't feel it. That doesn't work. You need to look at what is really positive about the situation. Yeah. So, for example, I was talking about the relative who was in hospital for, in the ICU for a couple of weeks, and his wife, who was in home isolation at the time. I think she did that perfectly, because obviously the situation was just awful, because she didn't know whether her husband was going to survive. It was dreadful. And she still found some wonderful moments, like when her grandchildren came to wave at her and stood there, like waving wholeheartedly, excitedly at her in the window, or when she was calling the nurses and doctors. She said, like, this, taking such wonderful care of him. They've just given him his moustache, like they barbered his moustache, like these kind of little things. Yeah, and that was when our health system was completely under duress, under stress, and they still did those kind of things. And she picked up on those things that were sincerely positive things. And I think that, for me, is such a lovely example of picking up on things that are sincerely positive, instead of trying to just rationalize that the situation isn't as bad. Because, as you can imagine, particularly in such a critical situation, that doesn't help at all.
Yeah. So you mentioned the research and that it needs to be heartfelt. And then another research came to my mind that shows that if we force ourselves to smile, even if it's just by putting a pen between your teeth, which forces your mouth to go up, that this already will have a positive impact on your mind, that you will feel more happy. So maybe
that's body posture. I love that. I read that research as well. So just the smiling. And I have some workshops and trainings on how to facilitate change in a positive way. And one of the exercises I always love doing is doing these kind of negative and positive postures. So in the negative example, I ask people to stand up, and then they stand up, close their eyes, and they slouch forward, so their shoulders come forward, their belly comes out, and they're just hanging there. Let their arms hang about, and then I'm asking them how they're feeling and what they're thinking. And then after they've done that, then we do the different exercise, which is the positive posture. I don't tell them that by then, I tell them that afterwards. And then they stand up, like, very straight, put their shoulders back and down, but in a relaxed mood, and their head up, close their eyes, pull their tummy muscles in, and then ask them, what do you feel and what do you experience? And then ask them to put a smile on their face, and then explore what they're feeling and what they're thinking. And what comes out in most groups is that actually, the positivity, it really works. And they say, I wasn't aware of, just by changing my posture, that within a minute I can feel so different and so positive and so active.
Yeah, so maybe it's a mix of both. That, yes, it must be heartfelt, but you can also kind of help others to nurture this heartfelt positivity.
I think the difference is whether it's rational, so you can't think your way out of it, because the examples we just talked about, they're through the body. So you're asking your body to do something which changes your thinking. So it's the other way around. It's not just saying your mind saying to your body, you've got to feel like that. But if you're doing something to your body, for example, the smiling or standing, tall, one straight, then your body says, oh, I'm feeling good.
Yeah, I like that. And we're talking about positivity. And I wonder, what is the difference between positivity and optimism?
Gosh, that's a great question. There must be a scientific definition, but I think for positivity, it's heartfelt. You experience that. And the way I define positivity is really in a way of positive emotions. So, for example, there's great research by Barbara Fredrickson, and she looks into positive emotions and what kind of positive emotions people have. And she found out, for example, that the positivity ratio is about 3-1. So you need 3 positive emotions or events to cancel out 1 negative emotion in order for you to thrive. To give some comparison material, most people are normally at 2-1, and people in depression, for example, are 1-1 or even worse. Yeah, and I know before people start telling me, is that research entirely sound? Because there have been some questions on the validity of that work. But we also see from social studies that normally, because we people are born evolutionary in a way that we perceive threats much stronger than we see the positive things.
Yes.
Think like person, Sahara, tiger, running away, reacting to it because you have to survive. So that's why we perceive threats much more strongly and we remember them much more clearly than the positive things that happen to us. So just to cancel the negative out, you need at least 2 to 1. And then, if you want to flourish, obviously, and go into this upward spiral and really develop yourself and be active and move forwards, then you're at 3 to 1.
Hi, this is Andrew. I'm a facilitator and head of customer success at Session Lab, the dynamic workshop planner tool. More than 30,000 facilitators, trainers, and coaches use our workshop planner tool and save time and effort in the design process. So, how do they do it? Our drag and drop agenda builder makes it easy to transform your ideas into high-quality workshops, and the timing of your agenda automatically updates when you make changes. You can collaborate in real time with your colleagues and easily share professional-looking printouts with your clients. And if you need inspiration, you can check out our library of more than 500 activities and exercises and simply drag the ones you need right into your workshop agenda. So check out Session Lab to save time and effort in your workshop design process. And now get your first 2 months of Session Lab Pro absolutely free at sessionlab.com/workshopswork.
So what would be your advice for us to actually nurture this positivity or even resilience? What is the difference between resilience and positivity?
They found resilient people that one of the core aspects, like people that have high trait resiliency, they actually have a lot of positive emotions. So positive emotions actually lead to more resilience. But then I find that a really interesting piece of research that also says that people that are more resilient, they also are more likely to see the positive and then experience positive emotions. So it goes both ways.
So it's a positive loop, basically. So
yeah.
all you need to do is to get into that loop, and then it's self-enforcing.
Yeah, that's one of the things.
Great. So what can we do to start this positive loop?
I think that's basically 2 ways to go about it. One is by actually looking at picking up on the positives that are there in life. So the example I talked about with my relative and his wife, I think that's a perfect example of his wife picking up on the little positive things. You can do that in your own life as well, like the cup of coffee I was talking about that you were grateful for, or things that bring you joy, to just being very aware and looking through this positivity lens and then seeing what is positive to you. And I think you can find positive things in most situations. For example, when I was a branch manager, I used to travel from the Netherlands to the southern parts of Germany every week. And these are about 350 kilometers. And I'd drive the same road. And sometimes it was winter, it was dark, it was cold. I'd never get there in the advised travel time. It always took me way longer. There were traffic jams. It wasn't the best of circumstances. But then I found out that, once I started getting into this groove and taking a flask of tea with me, listening to a lovely audio book, whenever I had to drive differently, or because the motorways it was blocked, the highway was blocked, for example, and I drive through country lanes, through these lovely valleys and vineyards. If you just look at that, that's exact same set of circumstances, but for me, a completely different experience. So I think the way you perceive things and what you put focus on, what you put focus on, that is actually what grows. So if you put the focus on the positive, then that is what grows and it makes it more easy to do that. So that's sort of one side. It's really looking at things differently. And I think the other side is what you're doing. And I think that is particularly important right now. So one of the exercises I sometimes ask people to do is, what brings you joy? What are the little things that you love doing? And for most people, it's like, cuddling with my kids or going out for a walk. They're really simple things that just cost some time. And I think those are the things that you can quite easily do at the moment. I think it's also important for managers, for example, to just encourage people, okay, let's have a little break. You can give them some breathing exercises or ways to connect with other people. Just call someone, just have a little chat with them to connect with them. And as long as you know what brings you joy, what makes you happy, you can build these small nuggets of positivity into your day. And then even 5 minutes doing something you love, like I'm an avid reader, I love reading. And for me, just reading a novel for 5 or 10 minutes, which is very short, but it really changes the way I experience that morning. Yeah. Because everything else seems to flow much more easily once I start adding little nuggets of positivity.
True. And it brings to my mind that it's so easy also for a manager to say, okay, let's have breakout rooms and just share what you're grateful for today in pairs of 2. And just to bring this connection, which is usually positive for people, and talking about themselves and talking about something nice.
Yeah, exactly. It's really easy. And I think as a manager, it's really important and to also take the time for them and show them it's okay to do that. Because with some firms, you just notice that people are a bit scared, but what if I do that? And my manager then says, what have you been doing? Or if you connect to other people and just randomly call them to connect with them, what if my manager says, you should be working and doing your work? So I think there's some people that have some hesitation about doing that and connecting or having a short break in between work, because what if my boss calls me and I'm not there, I'm not answering the Zoom call or Teams call or whatever.
What would you recommend then?
Giving the example yourself as a manager. So if as a manager, for example, you go through these exercises where you do that with your team and you actively encourage them, okay, just call someone and catch up with them. For example, at the next team meeting, ask, hey, did anybody call and what was it like? Or you might have in your internal communications channel, you might have a channel on there specifically on how are the group conversations going or whatever initiative you got going on. If you show sincere interest and you actually applaud it afterwards and say, wow, I see that so many great conversations have been going on, and people see that it's actually okay to do that.
Yeah. Leading by example.
Yeah. It's living the talk.
Yeah. And staying with the manager and the concept of positivity, especially with your background in change management, change facilitation, sometimes it is difficult. And I think that many managers, or at least from what I have perceived so far, there's always this resistance. Yeah, but we cannot just sugarcoat the problems. Sometimes the problems are hard. So how do you bring positivity into a conversation without sugarcoating or just ignoring actually the negative sides, the harm, the grief?
I think in this case, it comes down to the genuine and sincere positivity. So if you're sugarcoating things, that is not positivity by my definition of positivity. That's sugarcoating, that's greenwashing, that's whatever it is, but it's not sincere positivity. And I think another thing that you see from research, which I particularly love, is that these managers, they're optimistic and they have this positivity, but at the same time, they're also embracing uncertainty and, giving space to these uncertain circumstances and saying, okay, well, it's okay that we all feel very tired and that some people haven't slept that much because they've not been able to sort out childcare because there are no childcare facilities or whatever. So it's also acknowledging that. I think combining these two things, the heartfelt positivity, the genuine positivity, and then also giving space for the negativity, and then showing people how you embrace this uncertainty, how you embrace these difficulties. Because what most people want to do is, okay, I've got to solve this, I've got to resolve this, I've got to find a solution. And right now, in many situations, you're not going to find the immediate solution to that specific problem straight away.
Nobody
like we
knows.
were informed, yeah, exactly. Nobody knows how long it's going to take. So then it's much better to actually show your employees like how you're embracing the uncertainty and how you're dealing with it, and that that it's okay to say, okay, we're in this shitty situation. And yes, it is shitty.
Yeah.
I'm not slept or...
Yeah, and acknowledging it.
Yeah, acknowledging it and giving sincere space for it. And you've got to, show that and lead by example, as you said before, in this case as well.
Something comes to my mind that I once read. It was actually a parenting book. And I think it perfectly aligns to that, where the advice was when children are, for instance, they're playing and one child is taking away a toy from the other one. Mm-hmm. And then the child starts screaming and crying. And very often the intuition of parents is to solve the situation and to say, okay, so you're going to share. So now you can play with this toy for 10 minutes and then you can play with the toy with 10 minutes. Mm-hmm. And usually this doesn't help the situation. It rather escalates it because children don't have a concept of time and they don't care about a solution. And if the parents instead would say, oh, you are angry because this child took your toy away. And then the child would say, yes, yes, yes. Oh, and you would like to play with this toy by yourself. Yes, 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 yes. So just acknowledging the feelings the child has without trying to solve it or to find a solution already calms the child down because they feel heard.
Yeah.
And I must admit that I tried this strategy at some point with my mother. When she was getting angry and complaining about things, initially I always tried to find a solution. And at one point I changed the strategy and just acknowledged, repeating what she said, saying what she feels, and then she calmed down without any solution. And I think the same can actually apply for managers, just acknowledging.
Yeah, because I think from the parenting example, the two aspects you said, recognizing and acknowledging it. And the good thing about that is that you're setting your children up to be emotionally resilient because they're aware, hey, I'm feeling like this. And I think much of the generation that are, for example, now in their 20s, I work with universities and universities of applied sciences quite some bit. And they say, like, it seems like this generation that is at university right now, but they're not as resilient. It seems like parents try to sugarcoat that and they've not really learned how to recognize their emotions or deal with their emotions. That's what I love in your parenting example, because just by that example of that child, the two children playing with a toy, and then the parents helping the child to recognize what's going on and acknowledging that, it really, really makes them and sets them up to have this kind of emotional conversation and to be emotionally aware of what's going on. And I think at the same time, and this also applies to managers, once you start really listening and saying, okay, you're angry, you're doing this and you're that, and you're doing that, and you're feeling this, and this is your experience, like you did with your mum, you're actually connecting to them emotionally. Whereas if you're offering a solution, most of the time you're connecting logically, and this emotional connection is so much stronger than the logical connection.
And if we're emotional about a topic, usually we don't even hear the logical arguments. No. Because it's our animal instinct, our animal brain that is active.
Yeah, exactly.
Focused on surviving. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this emotional component is also very strong. I read some research on change and how employees' efforts, how high the effort of the employees was in change initiatives. And once they have only a logical, rational explanation, compared to when you also have like an emotional tie to that, when you have an emotional tie, they put in much as much effort as just a logical tie. And I find that quite striking. Because if you look at the way change initiatives are usually organized in organizations, they go on about the rationale and why we're doing it, and only about the rationale. That's where they invest most time. Whereas this emotional connection actually makes sure that you're driving the effort much more strongly than just the rational story. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do the rational story. By all means, it's very important to do that as well. But the emotional aspect is definitely there.
Yeah, and I once read that in the change process, it's also important to highlight what is remaining.
Yeah.
So what is not changing? What is actually staying as it is? And apparently this increases significantly the outcome of a change process if the managers and change facilitators underline what is actually remaining.
Yeah, I guess that also links to one exercise or one tool that I usually give managers when they're in a change training. And that is to start with what works well. I just love it. Like if you start a session or even if you start a group conversation, there could be a weekly meeting. What went well last week? Or if you start a session and you want to have some changes, for example, to your client base or whatever you're trying to do. Then you can say, okay, but what works well right now? And people are talking about it and they're sharing anecdotes. They feel connected to the organization. They feel proud of some of the things that are going on. And that's a much better basis. And you're much more open, more positive, and much more creative when you start from that. And then say, okay, there's some things that aren't going well. Let's see if we can figure out what is not going that well and how we can resolve that. But you're starting from a complete different point.
You're basically priming the group into positive thinking. And then they're also much more solution oriented when you then say, okay, what is not working? And what can we learn from the things that are actually working about in order to solve the others?
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. It's such an easy exercise and it's so powerful. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's also when you just start your weekly meeting. If you ask people, okay, what are the little success stories or something that happens? And you should mention that they're the small things. Give an example yourself of something really small. And once you get people sharing, I've seen that having such a good effect. And it's entirely different from a team meeting where people say, okay, what have we got on our plates? Yeah, this is not going well. Or that person complained, if we've got a conflict with that, or this customer is complaining. Because you start in such a negative way with all the problems, then you get into this negative sort of cycle. And once people are in that one, they can't think creatively, because in order to think creatively and out of the box and come up with generative solutions, you need to be in this positive flow. That's just how we're organized.
Yeah, that's it's simple. Like if you start with this, it's so true. I can see it in front of me. It's like taking all the air out of a balloon, right? So you just take away all the energy of a group if you start with complaints.
Yeah, exactly. That's a wonderful analogy.
Yeah. And before we hit the record button, you mentioned that you're currently conducting positive experiments. And back then I stopped you. I didn't want to know more because I wanted you to share also with the audience. So what is the story with these positive experiments and what have you found out so far?
So at the beginning of Corona, I've been really working on video material. And some of the things I have been thinking about for a long time is like, how can you organize these micro interventions, particularly on positivity and change. So what I'm doing now with positive experiments is that basically in an organization, the employees or a specific group that you select, they get one video every week. There's some explanation that's all scientifically based, and then they get a very specific experiments that they can do themselves for a week. Sometimes it's connecting people to other people. Sometimes it's something they can do individually. And it's very, very practical. And then we measure how their positivity and happiness develops over time. We've got some feedback loops in there as well, what they liked or what is not going well or what is going well in the organization. Obviously, we start asking what's going well, what went well the last week. Then we ask what didn't go so well. And based on the feedback that we don't get, we select the next experiments for them to really go into this kind of flow. And we then also have some live events in between to really connect people, but also to do the experiential learning that they're actually diving into something like that body posture exercise I talked about before. That's one of the examples where people really feel what it is about. And that's a way to just dive into positive psychology, but also behavioral science. And I think it makes it easier for managers because I've got some experiments which are particularly for the individual employees, so they can do it themselves. But other ones are really for managers, like what they can do with their teams. For example, they're starting with what works well. That's one of the experiments that is in there. And I think that really facilitates managers in doing something new every week or trying out something new every week, potentially. And it only takes them 3 to 5 minutes to watch the video. Some are actually even 2 minutes. So it doesn't take a lot of time, but they get this research-backed idea on how to promote positivity or whatever the issue is in the organization.
And what I love about it is that you you can show and track the progress, which will then reinforce the motivation to actually engage with it and to use this as a new habit. Because what really drives us is the perception of progress, right? Of meaningful progress. We see that what we do actually leads to something that is better than it was before. So if they see the positive outcomes and that it actually has an impact, then they will be also more likely to watch the next video and to try it out.
Yeah, it's a quick feedback loop. So you got this quick feedback loop that I absolutely love. And just the fact that by all the feedback we get, we adapt what we're giving them next. Yeah. And it might, in some cases, it actually underline some underlying issues that organizations have. And that's also really good to give some feedback to. So I find, for example, if you've got an employee survey, like lots of organizations do that every 2 years, but it's like once every 2 years you do that. And then you're not measuring what happens with it. You don't give people frequent opportunities to tell what's going on. And with this one, you get this feedback. You can automatically then say, okay, now we're choosing this, or we're going for that, or we're addressing some things. And then you move on. So it is much more dynamic than tools that are being used right now in many organizations.
Love it. How do you measure positivity or happiness or satisfaction?
There are actually some scientific measures, there's some scientific studies that have been done. So that's how we know what you can use to actually measure those things. The positivity is mainly how people are feeling. And there's a metric behind it because, as I mentioned before, people are remembering and experiencing negative things or negative events twice as strongly as they would positives. So obviously you've got to filter that out because otherwise it wouldn't be comparing those things equally. Then you can measure what is going on in the organization.
And I realized that we are almost approaching the end already. I didn't see the time running. And we talked in the very beginning about what is the difference between a bad and a good workshop. And you highlighted what makes a good workshop, all this engagement and speaking time. And you gave a lot of examples to make a workshop work or a meeting. And I still always ask the question, what makes a workshop fail?
If a workshop is not designed specifically for an organization, so if it offers a solution to something which isn't the problem at that organization, then it's a wonderful workshop, but not really answering the question or giving a solution to what's going on. So I think when you're designing a workshop or going into a conversation with a client initially, it's so important, like, why is that important? Why? And if you ask this question, like, why 5 times, you really find out what's going on. And then you need to design this workshop at a deeper level instead of offering, for example, a lovely workshop, but which really doesn't help people, which isn't so very helpful because it's not a solution to this specific situation that they have. It's not opening the conversation on the specific situation they have.
Yes. Oh, this is so relevant. It happened to me that the client wanted a team building workshop. And then when I started interviewing the participants, I realized that it's not about team building, but they just needed more structure. They needed clarity about the processes, the responsibilities, and decisions. So they were perfectly fine as a team, but they were missing leadership, actually.
Yeah, you could have done your best team building measure and nothing would have changed, even though your workshop would have been lovely, but it was just not what they needed at that moment.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's why I always ask the participants one-on-one. Yeah. It's really worth the time. But yeah, I agree. We spoke for almost 1 hour. If someone fell asleep after minute 1, just woke up and doesn't have time to listen to the entire conversation, what is it that you would like them to take away?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think for individuals, if you want to work on your positivity, genuine, heartfelt positivity, just try to do some things that you love and add some things you love and enjoy through your days, even if it's 5 or 10 minutes, that really works. To pick up on the positives that are happening right now, however small, And as a manager who's missed out on this lovely episode, try to be genuinely positive with your team, but the genuine is important. So no sugarcoating, that's not positivity, but pick up on the things that are really going well. And in these difficult times and highly uncertain times, welcome uncertainty, embrace it, and be an example so your employees can also learn from you that it's okay to say, okay, I'm in a shitty situation right now. Okay, I'm not able to deliver my best because I've got children running around or whatever your situation might be. But that is okay in the moment, to be self-compassionate and be kind to yourself in that situation.
Love it. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you so much for the lovely exchange and wonderful examples you gave.
And I feel so much more positive now.
Good.
Very uplifting. Thank you, Lisette.
Thank you, Miriam.
And I will put all the information how to find you and continue the conversation and learn more about your work in the show notes.
Thanks.
Thank you for staying tuned and listening to the show. I appreciate your attention as I know how busy you are. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and engage by sharing your comments and thoughts, and visit workshops.work to download the one-page summary. I'm looking forward to seeing you back at the next episode, and I wish you a fruitful day.